Cheers.
Malmigwa, ang Nyamal Tuor, here with Sharon Hutchinson, or Nyarial as you all know her.
Malmigwa.
So thank you so much, Sharon, for having me today and for having this discussion of your wonderful book, Nuer Dilemmas. I'm so excited to discuss this book with you for many different reasons. One being that I'm an anthropologist in training myself. I'm currently a PhD student in anthropology at Harvard. But I'm also a Nuer. I'm a Nuer diasporan. I was born in Asosa, Ethiopia. My family is from Nath, South Sudan. I moved here when I was 2 and was raised mostly in Tennessee, and then also in Iowa, and for 1 year in Omaha, Nebraska. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming to visit us here.
So, as we know, for anthropologists, Nuer society is one of the most studied societies, and perhaps we can say in the ethnographic sciences in general. And this was because of Evans Pritchard, who was a British anthropologist who came to Nuerland in the 1930s and wrote 3 books about Nuer people. I think many Nuer in the diaspora have encountered some of his books. But when you read his writing while you were in school, you noticed that he almost completely ignored Nuer women's lives, their work, and their contribution to society. So I'm so grateful and happy that you went and you filled this gap and brought women to the forefront throughout this book, but most specifically in the 4th chapter. I'm happy you did this for many reasons, but one of the main reasons is through this work, you showed how in the changing social system for Nuer people, women were very much active agents. And if they weren't successful in their actions, there was a continued struggle to realize a sort of society that would be beneficial to women as well.
And to the whole society.
Exactly.
And to their children.
Yes. Exactly, holistically. So with regards to women and women's lives in Nuerland, can you tell me what you actually encountered once you went to Nuerland? So,
in terms of, well, I was very blessed. Unlike Evans Pritchard, who I don't think felt free to talk to women, and I don't know how good his Nuer actually was, but if you look at his books and you look carefully, he's constantly saying things, well, the men said this, and the men said the women think that. But you don't have any quotes from women at all. So I was lucky because in Nuer culture at the time, I could be considered a foreigner and an honorary guest, and therefore an honorary man. And so I could move freely, totally freely, between the men's conversations and discussions and then back to the women. And so this gave me also options. And there were lots of areas that Evans Pritchard might not have experienced because he just couldn't go there. But I was invited to attend births and to all kinds of other things. And I could sneak off into the kitchen and talk to women about what they were thinking. So I did have more freedom. For me, being a woman researcher in South Sudan, among the Nuer, gave me a lot of access, more than a man. So in terms of when I got there, I realized even before I went that women, have their own sources of social power. If Evans Pritchard talked a lot about how, Nuer are dependent on their cattle and their, he called them mutual parasites at some point. And he talked about how important cattle were for men, for, whether initiation, getting your ox for your identity from your dad, or whether you were a young man who wanted to get married, or whether you were a powerful father who were deciding, or an uncle, whether you will give cows or not. All of the chiefs that they were invented by the British, they were all men. So they had a powerful set of situations. And in fact, if you look deeply at what some of the things are tying men together, and all the society, is everybody wanted to not die the bad death, which means you wanted to have children who would carry on your name and line. And in some ways, marriage among men within a family was really a matter of names, keeping alive through progeny, whatever man was born into that family and reached a certain age. So Evans Pritchard talked on and on about cattle and how important they were, and particularly for procreation. But actually, if you think about it deeply, women didn't need cattle the way that men did. Among men, all the men of the family, the idea was there was this kind of a myth, really, of the ancestral herd passed down, but that every man was supposed to draw upon in terms of their age order to marry and then, bring, more cows for the daughters and keep this going. So in some ways, because marriage is primarily a matter of names, this cattle could be considered kind of collective fertility among men. Because if you're a man, it really didn't matter how many women you might have impregnated in your life. If you didn't have cattle, either to marry her or later on, after conscription, to kind of rock, to make the child yours, to cattle on the back, then they're not your children, right? But for women, even though they were married with cattle, and that had definite impacts, they did not need access to cattle the way men did to fulfill their dreams as women. Their social promotions, as it were, their striving to gain some status, more status and independence in their household, was totally tied up with their fertility and their children, and bonding themselves with their children and creating a strong things. And even though cattle played a role, women had their own kind of secret power related to cattle, and that was cattle as sources of milk, cattle as, the cooking food. And in some ways, food was a way at that time that women could exercise some constraints on their menfolk. So to recap a little bit, women had their own sources of power, but they were not dependent on cattle. So do not make the assumption that maybe Evans Pritchard gave you, that, cattle move and then women follow. Not really. If you look deeply at the court cases and everything that's going on, you'll see women move and then cattle follow their trail. So it's really women's movements that determine ultimately where the cattle end up. So back to women's secret power. You see, one of the aspects of men's lives was they wanted to project socially for their own dignity, kind of self-restraint. They never wanted to be seen as dull or greedy in the mouth. So they had all kinds of table manners, if you want to call it that, about food. And once you were initiated, you had to respect these table manners. And once you were initiated, you were supposed to transform totally your relationship with cattle. Before you're initiated as a man, when you milked them, that was okay. You could collect the dung. You were at beck and call of your elders, both genders. But once you were initiated, the idea is you leave all that behind. That's for the uninitiated boys and women, etc. And you become not someone who depends on cattle every day, but rather you take a new status. You are now a controller of cattle, a protector of cattle. You take responsibilities for defending and raiding and whatever. So that distance between that men achieved through the scarification symbolism to be men was associated both with a change in relationship with cattle, from one of dependence to one of control, independence, protector, and sacrificer. You could kill them too. So those are the prestigious elements of manhood. Now, along with that came a lot of issues with food, because as you may know, for generations, Nuer had notions in the countryside that there were basically two kinds of people out there, particularly when it came to men and women's relationships. There were the women who were your sisters and mothers and aunties and whatever, and those women, it was perfectly fine to eat in front of them. They were feeding you, right? Because they controlled the food, and that said, cooked food and milk. But in front of unrelated girls and unrelated people in general, it was a big shame to be caught satisfying your physical need for food, even water. Okay, you didn't want to drink or see them, and people at that time would go to extreme lengths. Let's say you're dating a girl you met at a dance, And by definition, this girl, if you're dating her, cannot be a relative, because you don't want to marry a relative or have relations with them, sexual. So what they would do is they would go long periods, okay? They might have to hike to a dance far away. But once you got there, you would never drink water. You try to project this image of somebody who has no needs, and that's a source of dignity. But it's a source of dignity that in some ways it was women, particularly the relatives, who gave you the cover, because they were the ones now interacting with cattle as a dependent. They were the ones feeding you and this and that in safe environments so that you can maintain this image. So anyway, back to cattle and women. So women, as I'm saying, they don't necessarily need cattle to become full women. If you think about the Nuer name for woman, shit, it really is also married woman, but it's basically in Nuer culture at that time, and well, you tell me more now in diaspora, I don't know, but when the line between girlhood and womanhood in Nuer culture, traditionally, if you want to look at it that way, was not menstruation, first showing that, no. It was actually the experience of giving birth. It was only then, that you became, a full woman in their eyes. And, I had to struggle with this boundary because at the first I went there, I hadn't given birth. And sometimes it was, kind of awkward for me. So they considered me a girl, a schoolgirl, but initially. So women had this power. And so because they didn't need that line to become a woman, didn't depend on any cattle. You can give birth to whether you're married or not, whether some cattle have flown around your back or not, but that child is yours no matter what. So the experience of childbirth, the experience of all of that is very much part of the experience of women becoming full women. Now for men, we know at that time it was initiation, okay? So the scars and standing up, even the act of initiation is one in which you show self-restraint, dignity, but not crying out. You don't want to have the wiggles on your brow, so all of these are there. But this carried into marriage because even though in many places nominally the wife or the husband was formally in control of the food supplies, in reality, the men would never go near the kitchen. They would never, so the control the men had, at least in terms of the daily food, was much more in the hands of women, because in the end, they decided how much they cooked, when they cooked, and how much their men folks ate. And so this was a kind of a source of power. And of course, that meant that they were also allied with cattle as sources of food and things, because the men, one of the big things about initiation is you could never again milk a cow directly and drink it. I mean, they have emergency procedures. You can swap your gourd with someone else if it's like only men and whatever. But that's the idea. And so women could use this power over food, like cooked food, milk, to express their disappointment, shall we say, with some of their husbands, fathers, or community actions, okay? And I ran across examples of these in the past and in the present. It's important to note before I give these examples that according to the customary courts at the time, if a wife refuses to cook for her husband, that is not grounds for divorce. That if she decides, his behavior is just beyond the pale, I'm going to express my anger in this way and just neglect to cook food for that person, there was nothing that man could do. I have seen men go to chiefs complaining, my wife is refusing to cook for me and blah, blah, blah. And so the chief would just turn and say, just laugh, literally laugh. He said, do you think all my wives cook for me? Now, of course, men could have married different wives and play them off against each other. We'll get there. So basically, women had this power and they could use it. I remember hearing historically, there was a very famous fighting that was going on, a feuding in Eastern Gadja country. I can't remember the names of exactly the Sheng at the time. But what happened was the women collectively on both sides said, enough is enough. This is silly violence. And they collectively just stopped cooking for the menfolk. And the menfolk could do nothing. Within 2 days, allegedly, this feud ended, or at least the fighting.
Wow.
Okay, that's really powerful. And I remember even when I was in Western, and that was Eastern example, I was in Western Nuer, they had spear fights. They were still using spears in the 80s. They didn't have many guns at all. Anyway, but I remember, there was a big fighting, broke out, spear fights. And I was surprised. I talked to some man, who ran off to join the fight. And I talked to him after, I said, just questioning, like, well, just help me understand, so you ran off to this spear fight before you had any idea what it was about or whatever, was happening, which is kind of what you're supposed to do in the culture anyway. But I asked him, pushed him, and he finally kind of looked down and he kind of confessed that his biggest fear was for his supper. I was surprised. He said, well, if I hadn't joined in, the food might have run short. And so this surprised me. So I actually went to his wife and I said, your husband said this, is it so? And she looked up and she said, basically the food of a coward might indeed run short. So they had power, Other examples I can think of, oh yes, when I was in Western Nuer, I was living with a lovely family of earth priests who Kelwa Nyarial, and greetings to all of your descendants and people I knew there. Anyway, there was one time where Kelwa had gone off to Bentiu for allegedly just to some bureaucratic thing for a long walk, okay. But and people expected him to return in a few days. But you know what happened? He delayed and he delayed. We're talking weeks now, right? And so he had 10 resident wives. So, and they kind of agreed on rotation, sort of, not always, but anyway. So when he came back, the first night he came back, he found some supper. Now I know all this for a fact because when he was at home, I genuinely ate and spoke with him, with the men, because I could be honorary man. So anyway, so the first night we had dinner, but the second night, no dinner showed up. And so Kerlawal, and since I ate with me, we had to go looking for supper that night. And you only eat 2 meals a day, so if you miss that one, it's a pretty big deal. So, and what does he do? He ran to other men's buyers to just walk, to find food, because it meant a collecting. And they did have a kind of ideology that, we men eat together, and so they couldn't, so he was welcome. Second night, same story. Third night, so he got the message. And when I talked to his wives about this, then they could say, oh, we just thought it was, wasn't organized or whatever. They had a way to say it. But they told me point blank that they were collectively angry that he stayed away so long. So these kinds of things. So I remember, one man sort of saying that in the hands of women, food, and they can cook food and supplies, is a very dangerous weapon. And another man talking about warfare and how women can pressure men either to attend fighting or not. He said, look around you, Nyarial, look around, you'll find, I don't know if it's true, but the bravest Nuer men are always henpecked husbands. So all of this is to say there were balances, and they had to deal with etiquette, and they had to do, but women's fortunes over time were much more tied up with her fertility and cattle as an ally in food. But for men, it was much more tied up with cattle as an ally in creating new relationships, sacrificial objects, these sorts of things. You could almost think of the culture as a whole as kind of looking at the cow from a feminist and a masculine perspective, and it was like divided to the extent that cattle symbolized something that could reinforce or magnify or create anew blood relationships, relations of mar, or stop bad ones, whether it's a shutan, blood wealth, and someone. But for women, they were allies in food. Does that help?
That definitely does help. And the stories that you share throughout the book are so exciting to read because, I mean, coming from Evans Pritchard, where he painted this picture of Nuer society as being kind of static, of power kind of being in the hands of men. I mean, you engaging with Nuer women during your fieldwork in the 80s.
And 90s and 2000, it went on and on.
Right, yes,
yeah.
4 decades, for a considerable amount of time. It shows just how dynamic power relations were. It shows just where sources of power come from, and that women actually had access, at times, a great amount of access to this sort of power.